Today on Chasing Leviathan, we pursue the big question: how have different models of the body shaped medical practice and our sense of identity throughout history? My guest is Dr. Paul Craddock, author and senior research associate for the Science Museum Group. We discuss the often gruesome history of transplant surgery, and I learn about the legal organ market in Iran. So come, have a seat with us, and learn to listen with me. Just kind of as we get started, want to thank you, and I want to ask you a little bit about your journey into this kind of history of medicine and why this book in particular.
Well, first, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here, and I like your Chasing Leviathan backdrop there. It's very nice.
Oh, thank you.
Not at all. Well, how I got into transplant surgery, I suppose, is the question, isn't it? Because I've never been a patient. I've given blood, but I've never been a transplant recipient of, and I never donated a kidney or anything like that. But I'm also not a surgeon. And it really started because I became interested in medicine and medical history in general. And I got accepted onto a PhD program. And I was, you don't necessarily know what you're going to research. And I was looking for some inspiration. And in fact, your listeners and you now can search for this. If you search for a woman called Jennifer Sutton, just Google Jennifer Sutton and the word heart, and you'll come across.
Why do I know that name?
Because you've read my book. That's probably why you know that name.
Now I feel stupid. Yeah. For those of you who are able to see on YouTube, here's the cover. It's Spare Parts, the story of medicine through the history of transplant surgery. And it's a really fun read, as well as very informative. So that's also why I know the name Jennifer Sutton, and now I feel stupid. But that's good.
I'm surprised you do, actually, because it was in the acknowledgements. But anyway, Jennifer Sutton, heart. Basically, I came across this picture when I was searching for some inspiration of what to do a PhD on. And I came across it, and it's basically a picture of, it's a photograph of a student, and she's staring at her own heart. And it's such an unlikely thing to come across. It was part of an exhibition. In fact, the first exhibition of the Wickham collection, which is a museum, medical history museum, not just history, medical museum as well, in London. And her story is that she had a condition called cardiomyopathy. Basically, that means the walls of her heart were thicker than they were supposed to be, and the heart struggled to pump the blood around her body. And the only cure for that is a transplant. So she had that, and the Wickham asked if they could have her heart as an exhibit in this temporary exhibition, and she said yes. And there was a photographer there. And you can see that picture by searching Jennifer Sutton and heart, and you can see that's the thing that sent shivers down my spine.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to work at the NHS, at the National Health Service. I was a PA, the only male PA in the whole of the part of the NHS I worked. And so I sort of shared this kind of an appreciation for the health service that this image sort of depicted. But more than that, I saw you can't look at that actually without seeing an incredible intimacy. An intimacy between a woman and her own heart. But also, if you think about it, the intimacy between that woman and the heart of the woman or man, the donor, whose heart is beating away inside of her, yet that person has died. So it's a very intimate image, and the photographer did an amazing job capturing that. And that sort of led to questions about, very deep questions where everybody asks themselves.
Yes.
What does it mean to have a body? Especially if your body, a particularly vital part of your body can be outside of you and you're looking at it and still alive. And if you can accept parts from other people. So what does it mean to have a body? What does it mean to have an identity in that case? What does it mean even to be human or even alive? You know, always very, very basic questions. And it struck me that transplant surgery always has always been seen as a kind of a medical history sort of race to be the first to transplant such and such an organ. You know, it's always been seen as a kind of an achievement, but actually it goes to the heart of what it means to be a human and what it means to be alive. And that's what I thought, well, I'll have to dedicate some time to this. So that became my PhD topic. And I wrote about 18th century transplant surgery in the PhD. And I discovered actually it goes well back. It goes much further back. It goes to ancient India. I'm being very animated. I don't know what it is you're bringing out. No, it's all good. I don't know what you're bringing out in me.
No, that was fascinating to me. It was like, I think it was 1600 years is the first mention of it.
No, well,
and it seems like and the practice predated it, right? I was talking about the book you referenced at the beginning, but I could be wrong.
Well, the book I referenced at the beginning, right at the beginning in the introduction, the first mention of a transplant operation is in, well, sometime between the 2nd and 6th century BC. So that's ancient India.
Yes, and very ancient.
You could say very ancient. Yes. Yeah. And the remarkable thing about that, if that's not remarkable enough for you, is that it was in the Sushruta Samhita, and that's an ancient Ayurvedic surgical text. And the procedures that are described in there, which includes a cesarean section, or what became known as a cesarean section, and cataract operations as well, they were considered traditional even then, even back, millennia ago. So it does have a very ancient heritage, but it also has a heritage that it's not part of, well, past the traditional Indian sort of framing. It's not. It sort of loses its place as part of an official, legitimate medical system, because when we next see evidence of skin grafts emerging, it's, as you mentioned, it's actually in the 1550s.
Right, in Italy, I believe.
Italy, that's right. Yes.
If I'm remembering.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I read the whole book. I'm not just, I didn't just like skim it. It was a really
I think you're
great
protesting
read.
too much there.
No, I just want, like, I'm definitely like, I'm tracking with all this. And for me, it seems there were very clearly a couple of threads that you kind of pulled throughout the book, right? One of them you've kind of touched on, identity, right? This idea that we are, from any scientific perspective, at least, embodied, like laying aside ideas of disembodied consciousness, which we've never measured. And so that is something you talk about quite a bit, even starting with the idea of noses and how important that was to someone's identity. And then the ethics of it, which I wasn't until I got to his name, Willem Kolff.
Yes.
And he was such a wonderful person. And I'm reading this, and like everything he did, he was so kind, and he seemed so genuinely interested in his patients. And all of a sudden I stopped and I was like, the rest of these people have been jerks. like that, you know what I'm saying? Like, I look back and I was like, oh, these have actually all been, not all of them, but most of them have been pretty terrible people. And the idea of the ethics of it and the ego.
Yes, I'm formulating thoughts about this because I can't believe that these people were. The word "jerk" doesn't come easily to an English person.
That's a New Englander speaking. That's a little, probably I have transgressed a boundary there. There were definitely unethical.
What I would say naturally, you wouldn't be able to broadcast. Yes. I don't think. But I don't know. Were they? because, there is a certain concern with when people are sorry, I'll start that thought again. When doctors, when scientists or proto-scientists were communicating about their work, there's a certain set of formalities that you're expected to sort of adhere to or uphold, and a certain attitude that you're expected to, I suppose, have publicly. And I don't know, I sometimes think maybe these people were sometimes really lovely. I don't know, I like to give people the benefit of a doubt. That sounds a bit wet, doesn't it? But yeah, I don't know, I don't want to judge these people as individuals. But they certainly were not nice to animals. They were awful to animals.
That comes out. And I appreciated that you said that, because this has always come at a cost, right? And there are costs to the animals, and there are also, I believe it was the transplant with when they first started transfusing blood, and they were trying to help the madman, and the scientists competing over this man's life as if he's an object. One, because he wants his transfusion to succeed, not that he's that worried about the madman, and the other because they don't want the other guy to succeed because they think this practice is dangerous and they want to preserve their place in the medical society. And he ends up dying in the middle of this. It's like,
but he doesn't die from the transfusion, though.
Right? No. He doesn't die from the transfusion. He dies because the other guy comes and pays his wife to poison him.
Well, I don't think she needed much encouragement.
Possibly.
I mean, if you were married, if you were married to a Frenchman who set fire to everything, and just sort of wandered around Paris naked, I think you'd probably. I don't know. I have some sympathy for her.
That's not the response I was expecting.
What response did you expect?
I don't know. That's fair. That's fair. Also, the fact that you did point out he was a Frenchman does feel very English. Yes, he's like, it's like he's setting fire to everything.
He's French,
and he's French. Yes,
well,
it's like
it's.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah,
my wife
I'm not judging either.
My wife and I did the 23andMe, the DNA testing thing, and it turns out she's from all over the place. She's actually from Vancouver, but I am the least diverse person you could hope to meet. I am something like 99.7% British, and the 0.3% is French. So,
well, there were all those invasions back and forth. I mean, that makes sense.
Sorry, I'm getting off topic there.
No, that's fine. So, and I understand. Like, I mean, it was clear that she did not take much encouragement.
Yeah.
But also it's clear that it seems obvious that the other party did visit her before all that took place.
It would seem to be the case, yes. And there was a history of that party railing against the idea of transfusion, because transfusion back then was it was quite controversial in France, a Catholic country. Yeah. I mean, you were talking about identity a moment ago.
Yeah.
Well, transfusion, we think of transfusion today as sort of replacing a bit of lost fluid, don't we, really, when it comes to it? Something that's been lost for a trauma of some kind. Well, back then, it was a collision between two medical systems. So the first one being the idea that the body is at least in part mechanical. So, excuse you. The body at least in part mechanical. So, you have the discovery of a circulatory system. So the blood circulates the body powered by a heart, which is like a pump. So that's early 17th century stuff. So early 1600s. So 1624, that theory was written up by William Harvey. Transfusion occurs when that theory collides with older ideas, because we don't know in that era what the blood is, what's in the blood. So people started to think, well, they thought to, ancient Greek and Roman myths about Jason and the Argonauts and the story of Medea was basically
Right.
I was on NPR yesterday and I told the whole story of Jason and the Argonauts, and it took about 15 minutes. And so I'm not going to start the whole story of Jason and the Argonauts. But at the end, when Jason's got the golden fleece and he's sort of returning home with his men, the whole city is out to celebrate, apart from his father. And his father, because his father's very, very old, couldn't get out. So when he claimed the fleece, he also claimed the king's daughter, who helped him with his challenges by casting magic spells. And he said, well, can you cast another spell and maybe take some years off my life and give them to my father? And she said, no, I don't want to do that. But what I will do is I will perform a ritual. And so she got the sort of wizened old man out of his hut, sort of placed him on some kind of, I don't know, splint or I don't know. He's placed him on the ground anyway, and prepared a potion, which she collected by flying around the world in a chariot, a magical chariot. She collected things like the beak of an old crow and weird ingredients from around the known and unknown world. She made a potion out of them, and she slit his throat, and the blood came, out of the throat, the hole, the slit, and she mixed the blood with the potion and then put the blood back in. Some versions say that he drank it. Others say it was straight back into the cut that she made. And then he started to transform. And his hair started to return to black from grey, and his wrinkles disappeared. And for some early transfusionists back in the 1640s in Britain, in England, in Oxford actually, Francis Potter, he sort of combined these two ideas of the circulatory system and blood having some magical power, and thought, well, if I transfuse some blood from a young animal into an old animal, then that old animal would become younger. And he tried it with chickens and hens and cockerels, that kind of thing. It never made it work. He couldn't get the blood across. But I've sort of gone off course a bit here because we were talking about identity.
No, this is perfect.
But it does come round to identity. I mean, there's a lot to the story of blood transfusion. It's also the story. The same story also gives us the idea of intravenous feeding. You stick in fact, I've got one here, a porcupine quill. So that's what was used. One of the things that transfusionists used to transfuse blood. It's kind of an articulation of that mechanical body. It's a mechanical equivalent of a blood vessel. You just snip the ends off and hollow it out. The first mechanical conduit to be used in a surgical procedure. Anyway, I'm going off on one again.
Well,
but
let me. So,
go on.
Okay.
No, I was just gonna
say. So you have these three threads, and they all weave in together.
Yeah.
Right. You have identity, and you have ethics, and the third one that really seems clear is the way that models played into and wove in between all of these, so that as people's understanding changed, it took almost like Thomas Kuhn talking about different scientific paradigms. They needed different models, and that helped people shift their identity. Well, and so I think it was so.
Well, when it comes to identity in relation to blood transfusion, this is what I was going to say as well, but it also relates to what you were just saying there. The idea of identity that people had is that you were an essence. You were inhabiting your body, and maybe you were inhabiting your blood. And if that's the case, a blood transfusion it's both very exciting and promising, because maybe you can make someone younger by transfusing some young soul or vital principle into their body. Maybe you can make them sane if they're mad by transfusing a calm lamb's blood into their body. So the idea of identity was very much at play in blood transfusions. But we do get that transforms a little bit later when we get just in the 18th century. That completely transforms. I don't know if you want to talk about sorry, I don't know if you want to talk about tooth transplants in particular, but they have it's a very distinct idea of identity, a more modern idea of an individual sort of tied up with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I really appreciate about what you even shared, and if someone's like, the Jason the Argonaut story is weird. Well, it's really important to understand that, like, you literally have like William Harvey explaining the circulatory system, and you have people taking that idea, and for us, we just transpose that. They're like, oh, they understood that, and we transpose it into a modern understanding. But that's not how scientific progress, even today, doesn't seem to work. It's you're piercing in a very singular ways, and then you have to wait for the rest of everything to catch up. So they figured out like the circulatory system, and then what they applied were Greek myths to it, and they applied Galen's humors to it,
Absolutely.
and they applied vitalism to it, and that was really eye-opening for me because when we read about, the way at least it was taught to me in school is like, William Harvey discovered the circulatory system, and then we understood the body, and it's like, no. And it's like, that was huge. And it eventually helped create this mechanistic model, right? Which was very useful for advancing medicine. But this, the things that they kept alongside it are just mind-boggling to us because we can't understand the inconsistency, but they didn't know. And so that to me was very fascinating, that whole idea.
Have you heard of an Irish healer called Valentine Greytreks? I might be pronouncing it incorrectly, bear in mind, because I've only ever seen it written. Now, he's not in the book, so it's not something where you're not lacking in any way. You haven't read this in the book if you don't know, because it's not in there. But basically, Valentine Greytreks was he had a very unfortunate sort of moniker. He was called the Irish Stroker.
That is
It's unfortunate, isn't it? But he was called the Irish Stroker because he apparently cured all kinds of diseases by going up to people and sort of not stroking them, but sort of, if you're on YouTube right now, you'll be able to see me make a fool of myself, and sort of doing that and sort of
massaging,
not even touching them, but
he didn't even touch them.
Sort of running your hands along the body, and there are reports of people being healed of all manner of things after being stroked by the Irish stroker. And some of the people who've put their names to sort of say, yes, we are serious scientists, Robert Boyle being one of them, John Wilkins. I always forget the name of John Wilkes or Wilkins because I know someone called James Wilkes or Wilkins, and I just mix them up. I think it's Wilkins, isn't it?
Yes. I do not remember.
I think it's Wilkins. So he was also one of the members of a Royal Society. The Royal Society to sort of say, yes, I've seen this happen. So they, they didn't necessarily what they considered to be to pass as knowledge and as legitimate wasn't necessarily what we'd consider a scientist. Well, the word scientist didn't exist to the early 19th century, but a proto-scientist, a virtuoso, like Robert Boyle, we wouldn't necessarily think he would be. Well, we would think of it maybe as being taken in by someone like Valentine Greytreks, who's a faith healer, essentially. But if you trust just your own senses, then I suppose you can be taken in by that kind of thing.
Right. And it's definitely the idea that science moves as a community of peers, right? So it's not just you can't just fool one person and then it becomes part of science. It's like, I mean, it does become part of science, then it gets evaluated and people are like, who's there's a famous gentleman who like went around and debunking faith healers, and like he would figure out different ways of like
Randy, the amazing Randy.
Yes, yeah, like, and that's always those are always fascinating. Like,
he's a very funny man too.
He just figured out. Yes, yeah. So, and that's always, and I think that's valuable work, right? Like, a lot of times, there's predatory things that go along with those kind of faith healing approaches.
Absolutely.
Certainly. So, but I did want to talk about too, as we talk about ethics, and this kind of goes with the models and identity and the whole ethics of it, is that in many cases, we look almost, I wouldn't say you write them like this. I don't think that's fair, but it's hard as a modern person not to see the guy who had like visions of angels showing him the terrible things that would happen with transfusion of blood, and he comes out and he just starts fighting the other guy. What he was afraid of would happen. You look at him, he's like, oh, he's the bad guy in the story because he's anti-science. Well, yes and no, because what we see is because of issues with the system. Like when you talk about teeth, the ethics of it, that section was horrifying.
It is horrifying.
The idea of children selling their living teeth to rich people so that their family can survive is I don't
it's
have words for that.
What's more heartbreaking, of course, is that things happen many magnitudes worse than that nowadays with kidneys.
Right. Right. And that comes out now, of course. Fortunately, as far as I understand, that's all technically black market. That's not.
Well,
so,
I think it's I can't remember if it's Iraq or Iran. One of the, I think it's Iran. Sorry, it was a while ago since I wrote that. So I think it was Iran. That you can sell your organs in one country of the world, and it's Iraq or Iran.
I believe it's Iran. Yeah, though that part. And the people not understanding the cost of giving up an organ and just seeing it as an easy way out. That every time that there is progress in science, this even happened with chemical. You can look at it from a warfare standpoint with chemical warfare and then nuclear warfare. We make this incredible scientific progress, and then it gets put into a system that already has issues. Right, we already have problems in this kind of situation. And then it just all like the system's already creaking, and then it just creates this horrific moment, right? Like the Cold War. Fortunately, with chemical warfare, you have World War I, and then for the most part, I know it's still been used, but it's normally at least hidden, and it's not like this full scale use of chemical warfare because countries of the world said this is terrible, right? And that's in some ways a good story, not a exciting story. It's still a little depressing, but as we look at this sort of things, right? It's like that was really fascinating to me. Can you talk to that idea of the challenge to ethics every time we have a new model or we have a new technique?
What I don't know what you mean.
So every time there is some kind of scientific progress, it does seem to pose, and this comes up a lot in your book, a lot of ethical questions.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, and so and oftentimes it just exacerbates ethical problems that are already present in our current systems.
I think that's the key, really. I mean, the massive change and where the ethical problems we've just been discussing with the black market in organs, for instance, and the tooth transplants, where that comes from is, well, it's a part of a fabric of modern society, and that emerged in the 18th century. So it emerged with a new idea, and we're back to identity again, actually.
Right.
So before this point, you have this idea of an identity. We talked about that actually. The idea of you sort of being a soul. That sounded a bit wrong, didn't it? No.
I didn't even catch it.
I heard myself say it, and I didn't say that, did I? A soul.
The vitalist tradition. Yes.
Yes. So you had this idea where you inhabited a body. Well, in the 18th century, that doesn't make any sense anymore, and so much changes in fairly short order. Actually, of course, it's always gradual in history. You never have a quick change really, but in fairly short order, you have shopping becoming a thing. You have fashion becoming a thing. You had pantomimes. Christmas trees, coffee shops. You had industry, the Industrial Revolution, sort of the first parts of that starting to sort of bubble away. And with that, you had a widening class system.
Mm-hmm.
And along with all that, and sort of part of all those social transformations, you have this new idea of identity. So I'm speaking in general terms when you can't really speak in general terms, but for the sake of brevity, I'll go with the word people and speak generally. People started to, stopped thinking of themselves necessarily as a soul that's inhabiting a body. They started to think of themselves as the body. So they identified themselves with the things that they bought, the things they owned, the things the people they hung around with, the things people did to them, all these external forces coming to sort of make up who you are, this self, this individual, in this modern understanding of that term. And that really comes from the 18th century, and it's both a product of those social changes and, I suppose, I want to say a symptom of them.
A driving force of that as well?
Well, it's part of the social change as well as being a product of it, I suppose you could
Yes.
say. Yeah.
There's that back and forth play between, like, they would discover this about the body, and then that would play back into the social changes that would tell them more about the body, and back and forth.
But where it all comes into sort of focus is a new science that emerged at that time. And that's the science of dentistry.
Right.
So the term dentist or dentiste, it was invented in France by a fellow called Pierre Fauchard, and he basically invented dentistry in response to, partially in response to this growing concern over appearance and preserving a natural beauty. So previously, even the king would have had their teeth removed and maybe cleaned with a rag, very basic care, just aimed at removing pain, really. So Louis XIV was toothless quite early on in his life because he was also quite a glutton. Dentistry.
It's hard when you're the king and no one can tell you no, right? That's
Well, in fact, he I don't know I can't remember if I put this in the book or not, but there are stories of him telling his operator for the teeth, not dentist, his operator for the teeth, to just treat him like a peasant. He doesn't care what happens, just as long as this damn tooth is removed. And he ends up removing part of his jaw. And then for the rest of his life, he sort of whistled funnily when he spoke. Which I mean, it is and isn't funny.
Right. I mean, it is one of those things. Like, yes, no, I understand.
But when you have it's 1728, you have the term dentist coming about, and Pierre Fauchard sort of set himself up in opposition to this sort of rural, backward-looking, or as he painted it, idea of just removing teeth. And basically, he introduced things like fillings, filing your teeth, cleaning them, washing your mouth out with urine, something that we don't do so much now, and transplanting teeth as well.
So much. I think we run in different social circles.
I dare say we do, but I wasn't referring to my own social circle. Well, I suppose there is Richard. No. No, but transplanting teeth was one of those.
Yes.
One of those items on his menu of treatments, and that was, it was a measure that was meant to retain your beauty. It was also part of a commercialization. All these other revolutions and changes we talked about a moment ago. It was part of that. But it really thrived on this widening class system, this widening inequality between rich and poor.
Very similar to the section on noses and how literally you could not be an emperor without a nose, right? And how important that was to the aesthetic side of it was to identity.
You couldn't be until Justinian II was.
Yes, exactly. It was considered a barrier, and he was like, you know what? I don't care. But that's why it was considered very, even the idea that it was a mar on your masculinity was fascinating to me, because you're either of low moral character, which is interesting to me that when you look at the description of the syphilitic nose, if I can put it that way, was it
saddle nose? Yeah.
You often see that. I wonder if that's why that shows up in Disney villains and stuff. If you think about Voldemort, and if you think about the Horned King and the Black Cauldron, I don't know if that's to represent a skull, or if that's a tracing back to the idea of low moral character. But anyways, that was something that struck me.
A friend of mine, Lindsay Fitzharris, has just released her new book for Facemaker, and this is a point she talks about, because Facemaker is about the horrific injuries sustained in the First World War, and the efforts of surgeon Harold Gillies to recast those faces, so to speak, and provide some kind of surgical solution to what was then thought of as facial disfigurement, but you wouldn't really think of it now. You'd like that. You'd say, I've forgotten what the term, facial difference or something. But anyway, she talks about how there's one character, and I've forgotten which one it is. One character who is good until he had a facial injury, and then he becomes evil. That seems like you can have a competition. Which one was it? Write in.
Right.
But, there is that association between facial disfigurement and evilness, which is very unfortunate,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Phantom of the Opera. Yeah. It's very unfortunate.
And that's that's where you can't trust this guy to be emperor until he shows up with and forces it militarily. But then you also have that's the whole thing with the teeth, right? They start to realize, everyone should have good-looking teeth, and that becomes an issue.
Well, not everyone. That's a problem, isn't it? Not everyone should have good-looking teeth. But if you want to get ahead and you can afford to get ahead, then you should be able to. You should have the financial. You should have the freedom to spend your money in that way. And just ruin someone else's mouth for your own gain.
Right.
That's to say nothing about the fact it didn't really work very well.
Right, not very often.
Well, it's some of them lasted, reputedly. Some you can never be sure, can you? Because doctors, surgeons, dentists, they will lie. It's all marketing. But some reports have said they've lasted 5 years. Some have lasted months. Some, considered successes. Some of them were from living children. Some of the donor teeth, so to speak, because they weren't really donated, were they? Some of those teeth were from battlefields, from collected by the barrel load from the Peninsular War, from Waterloo, and you sort of go into the dentist and
from the hanging.
And from Goya painted a scene.
Yes.
Of that,
the executed criminal, and they're taking the. Oh, yeah, that was. Yeah, fair warning to our listeners: if you do read the book, it is quite gruesome, and not that it is transplant surgeries, but it is if you like true crime, you might enjoy
Well,
some of these.
Can I
moments
just
here.
say, listeners, as well, that it's
Yeah.
but I try to be vivid in my descriptions, but I don't actually go in for gore. I'm not that kind of person.
That was very clear. Yes.
I
No,
believe
well,
it's for
it-
writers' responsibility to make the scene before you present.
Yes.
And if it's uncomfortable, that's because the practices were damned uncomfortable.
And that was exactly my point. So if I misspoke there, my
No
apologies.
need to
What I was
apologize.
saying
I just
was,
wanted
it was very vivid. It did not feel like you were like, you did not come across as like the Stephen King of medical history.
I've been called the Bill Bryson of medical history, which is very nice.
Oh, there you.
I mean, unfortunately, it was an Amazon review, not an actual critic, but but
still, yeah.
Still.
Yeah, I mean, you take what you can
Absolutely.
get. No, I understand. One thing that I definitely want to cover as well is this idea of one, because you have the amazing book with you, but the surgeon and the surgeons and their ego, where you have surgeons competing to be first, and that's where I brought up Willem Kolff and his work, which seemed to be very charitable and very generous. It seems he generally did it for the right reason. And then you have these other surgeons, they become celebrities. They are renowned for their infidelity as they're going on tour to talk about how they've done the first heart transplant that only lasted for a little bit. Can you speak a little bit to that, of how the egos of surgeons have played into kind of this new era of organ transplants?
It's really difficult to know how to pitch this, because in a lot of the things you read from the 1950s onwards, so mainly around kidneys, hearts, livers and pancreas. I don't cover livers and pancreas in my book. I don't know. I felt that would it would go on too long if I did that, and I wouldn't be able to say anything particularly new about those things. But when you're dealing with organ transplants, you do tend to have this narrative of some arsehole surgeon really leaning into them being an arsehole and just being so difficult to work with. Such a nasty character, so inflexible, and just arrogant. They know best. They are sort of the hero of their own story, and everybody else needs to understand that and work around it. Now, I have met quite a few surgeons from that period, actually. Some of them most of them have died now. I know one who's still alive, who's incredible, is an incredible person. In fact, every surgeon I've spoken to from that period I've found to be uniformly lovely, to be quite honest.
Huh.
I've been reflected on this because I never met Christian Bernard. He died well before I developed any interest in transplant surgery. And I know people who've worked with him, and he apparently was a tyrant. But those who I have met have been absolutely lovely. And I think, sort of reflecting on the story that we get told about transplant surgery, we usually just have this sort of narrative, even from a patient perspective, which I obviously can't speak to because I've never been a transplant patient, as I said at the beginning. So it's either a memoir of a patient's perspective, or it's some kind of history told by usually one of these surgeons or someone who's sort of bigging them up in a way. And I learnt fairly recently that in the 1960s, that's when hospitals and surgeons and doctors started to really get wise to PR. The importance of telling their own story and of crafting a narrative around themselves. And that marries up with the fact that in that period, post Second World War, it's a period that, we've just gone through a terrible time in world history. But that period is a period of optimism, and people want to believe that there are heroes out there. They want to believe that men, particularly, can make miracles happen. So part of me thinks that these people who come across as arseholes are not arseholes at all. They're just trying to sort of build their character as society demands it to be built. I mean, just an example of one character who I've met, John Wickham. Now, I don't think he was particularly active in transplant surgery, but he was an extremely he wasn't even really famous, but he was extremely important. He was one of the people who introduced laparoscopic surgery, keyhole surgery, into general surgery. So before it was for only specialist use, but John Wickham introduced it into general use in collaboration with radiographers and with instrument makers. And I interviewed John about this, I suppose, lifetime of achievement that he had. By the way, I was born prematurely, and without his work, I wouldn't be alive. And I said to him, John, how would you like to be remembered? And he said, oh, I don't know. Maybe I've saved one or two people a little bit of bother. But he said that genuinely, it was, I've just saved a few people a bit of bother. So I thought, oh, that's lovely. Yeah. And I did mention a surgeon earlier as well, whose book I showed you.
Yes.
Who doesn't really do a good job of presenting himself. I won't mention who that is, actually, because he's still alive.
That's fair.
But I can say he looks like a poor man's Columbo.
Yes, we did.
We came to agree on that, didn't we?
Yes, we did. And so I will not mention, because then people would, of course, look up the book, and I don't want to cause any Twitter beef for you. But the book title is very self-aggrandizing. How do you say that?
Self-aggrandizing, yeah.
Self-aggrandized, yeah. Like very much like the even, and I think this is where, this person might be lovely in person, but when you tout these sort of titles for yourself, these sort of amazing achievements, and you don't let other people do it, you do come across as an asshole.
That's right.
That is the way.
A lifetime of achievement in transplant surgery, or any other field for that matter, is something to be demonstrated, not stated. That's a lesson that that we could all sometimes do with learning.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Let another man praise you.
Yes.
And not your own mouth. Yes. It does. I mean, that's just. But you mentioned this, and I wonder, and I don't even begin to understand the industry in this respect. But you talked about they became wise to PR, and this is how they got donors, and so you wonder how much of this is driven by the fact that they want to pull in donations. They want to, if you can, to not the person we were just previously talking about, but someone from your book, when they call him Golden Hands, right? He's the man with the golden hands.
Bernard, Christian Bernard.
That's a great selling. Yes. That's a great selling point when you're looking for donations, right?
Well, I suppose that speaks to the PR point, doesn't it? Bernard didn't come up with the term golden hands for himself. His patient did. But it says a lot that everybody seems to have run with it, doesn't it?
Yes. It's a great headline. It's, and so that part was really fascinating to me. I want to be, aware of your time, and I want to be respectful of that. As we kind of start to wrap up here, can you give kind of the story of medicine through the history of transplant surgery? For you, one of the central questions was definitely identity.
Yes.
And so even the questions of ethics and the questions of models,
well, let me
we're all kind of subservient to that. And so talk to us about what that main idea of identity is, that main thread throughout the book?
Well, first of all, I'll show you this is the British copy, the original cover. Notice the subtitle.
A surprising history of
which
transplant.
is also, I didn't mean for that to go on there. It was supposed to be an unexpected history of transplants. But the editorial assistant at the time wrote down the wrong thing, and I maybe didn't correct it. Anyway, it's beside it doesn't really matter. The point in showing you that is to say that the subtitle, which I can never remember, of the American edition, The Story of Medicine Through the History of Transplant Surgery, that was also sort of given to me in a sense, because I could never defend that, because it doesn't go through the whole history of medicine. The history of medicine is bloody massive.
No.
So I could never, I can never, as a historian, I can't stand by that subtitle. But the thread throughout the book was initially, it was initially a collection of metaphors by which we understand our bodies and our relationships with our bodies. And it was a kind of meditation on what it means to be. So we had, we started off with the agricultural metaphor. So we talked a little bit at the beginning about this, about how, I don't think I mentioned this in particular, but transplant surgery at the beginning was a direct transposition of a horticultural technique. So it's a technique comes straight from farming. So clearly the case that the person who transcribed it, Leonardo Fioravanti, who, by the way, stole it from a secretive Italian family, he called it the farming of men, transplant surgery, and the farming of men and the cultivation of the agriculture of the body. That was it. And then later it got called the cultivation of the body as well.
The exact model, like they saw what they did with bark, and they just completely took that method and applied it to human skin.
Well, here, in fact, just opened up naturally to it. For people on YouTube, you can see that's the that's an 18th century illustration, but it's the, you can attach one being to another, and those two beings can feed a third. So it's just that technique applied to humans, and that's all a skin graft is. And that's sort of that is what the first transplant is. So it's an agricultural frame we work in. Also, culturally, it's culturally to do with the land of the trees. It was not emphatically not part of legitimate medicine at the time. So we move from that agricultural understanding of a body to a kind of a mechanical one. When we talked about blood transfusions and this investment in the idea that the blood circulates the body, is pumped around by a beating heart, a muscle, a pump, a mechanism. So you have this mechanical frame coming in. Going to the 18th century, that's joined by an economic idea. So you have this notion of body parts. We've not talked about this actually, but you have a notion of body parts that can be cut off from a source of life, or given life. So if you transplant not an arm, that never happened in that period. If you transplant a tooth, say, because we talked about that, into someone's tooth into someone else's body, then what scientists or proto-scientists thought happened in that period was that an invisible life, a living principle, a vital principle, made its way into that dead part, and it brought it to life again. And that really works on it's an economic metaphor. If you cut off a village from a source of income, a source of finance, it withers and dies. But you can introduce finance again and it will revive. So you have this economic metaphor coming in there, which of course resonates with the vast changes that are happening in society at that point. The Industrial Revolution, those massive differences, gaps between rich and poor, the shopping, all that stuff. When you get to the 20th century, I'm going to skip the 19th century because I will say something about the 19th century because the 19th century, science in general changes. The word scientist is coined for one in 1834.
Right.
And throughout that century, so many massive changes. Anesthesia, for instance, virology, bacteriology, X-rays, things that we just can't imagine being without today. They came along in the 19th century. And by the end of the 19th century, transplant surgery, blood transfusion seemed barbaric. It's ancient, barbaric stuff that people's great-great-great-great-grandfathers practiced. Which is weird because we think of it as a hyper-modern thing, don't we?
Yes.
Usually. But really, it's got such a long history. But by the end of the 19th century, a couple of things happen that I won't talk about in detail because I know we're running short on time. But basically, you have the idea of blood types, the idea of one body being chemically compatible with another, and that's an invention of immunology. So that's another one of those sciences to come from the 19th century. So you have that, and you have new techniques for operating, for sewing blood vessels together. It's a technique called vascular anastomosis. And in my book, I make the argument, and in fact, in peer-reviewed research that you can access through university libraries and whatnot, I make the argument that organ transplant surgery, at least partially, emerged from 19th century French embroidery.
Yes, I remember you saying that, and that that even plays into what we've been talking about with the egos of surgeons. That this woman's incredible contribution to something that is essential to transplanting is just kind of veiled over, papered over, so that the surgeon can receive the credit.
Well, that's sort of fair, sort of not fair, I don't suppose. I don't want to stick up for a eugenicist or a Nazi or a suspected Nazi, but partly that's the case. I don't think he would have acknowledged a professional debt to a woman because he thought they were inferior. But also the kind of contribution she made.
A eugenicist?
No. She was Carrel, Alexi Carrel, the person
so we can stick up for her. Yes.
Oh, we can stick up for her. Obviously, that's
Yeah.
I don't want to stick up for the.
No, I was saying. Right.
But I forgot what I was saying now. He wouldn't have acknowledged a professional debt to her, so that's true. But by the same token, the kind of change that she made to the kind of contribution she made to science and to transplant surgery would not have been recognized in the terms of the science of the day. In fact, only now are historians recognizing that to know something involves the body. You make things. I mean, in Columbia University, you have Pamela H. Smith working on this very idea that to make something is to know something. So this connection between the body and the brain, which it's not controversial to say there is a connection between the body and the brain, and they're actually the same thing. But the way that scientists have, and in fact, scholars in general have treated their subjects, you would think that if you did something with your body, it was completely nothing to do with any contribution to knowledge. If that makes sense. But back to the metaphors, that because of this concern with materiality, you could say, of the early 20th century, you then have a new metaphor emerging, and that's the metaphor of the fabric body. Now, historians treating transplant surgery before this book have just sort of gone with this idea of a body of being a machine. That's a few centuries earlier, but they think it sort of continues and maybe gets more pronounced when you start comparing bodies to aeroplanes and computers and things. But actually, the big change at the start of the 20th century, and it's down to the embroidery engagement, the big change is that you start to get surgeons really developing their fine skills, fine motor skills,
Right.
fine skills, so manipulating the material of a body. And that material understanding of a body is very difficult to put into words. But that's the great change that occurs, and that's what enables organs to be transplanted. It's that really serious and intense concern with the craft of surgery.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and that's very evident in your book as they kind of go through it, because there's that, yet another thing that you develop throughout is early on the doctors were men who would never actually put hands on someone. That was something that barbers did, who were unskilled labor.
Well,
Or
skills.
semi-skilled labor. Yes, but like it was a lowly
Yes.
occupation. You like, I believe one of the phrases is either lie like a dentist or you lied like a barber. These idea that men, yes,
Like
yeah,
a tooth
I can't remember
puller.
which one it was, but
It was neither.
definitely
It was a tooth puller.
lie like a tooth puller. That's what, and it was like literally like, oh, these guys get their hands dirty. You can't trust them. Listen to the men of science who never actually get their hands dirty. And so that movement is one. I'm much happier having someone who understands the science actually operating on
The thing is,
bodies,
people
right?
have
But
always
that's
been
another thing.
more happy to have someone who has experience with bodies operating on them. When surgeons,
Right.
when physicians had, this sort of dedication to Galen, and wouldn't touch you, then a lot of the peasantry would they wouldn't really stand for that.
And probably,
And
I
it
would
would
say
be
wisely
expensive
so.
as well.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So kind of as we finish here, what is, if you could leave our audience with one thing besides obviously buy and read the book, which is just a really enjoyable read, what would you leave our listeners with? What is like the one lesson you'd want to leave them with, or the one maybe call to action?
Oh, that's an interesting question. The thing that came up in my mind initially was become an organ donor. I suppose that would
Yeah.
be my call to action.
Yeah.
Well, a more sort of, well, a less direct call to actual action would be a call to think, really, or to. That sounds really patronizing. I don't mean it to be patronizing. I mean, the book really is about, when it comes down to it, it's about meditating on what it means to be, which is something I said earlier. So I suppose it's for two sort of life lessons. One is try to taste life as much as possible, and two is don't be an arsehole.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I don't say
words to
yes,
live
I
by.
don't say that so much in the book, but I think it comes down, this concern with transplant surgery as a culturally and socially important thing, and a way to think about what it means to live and what it means to have an identity. I think that the lessons you can take from thinking like that, from being sensitive to, I suppose, the complexity and the beauty and the troubling aspects as well of life, it does come down to don't be an arsehole and enjoy yourself. It's later than you think.
Well, and I love that. In some ways, it's almost a history of human dignity, or the indignities we often visit on others, right? And so this idea, like as you're talking here, of a black market where we just steal things from people. Like, I mean, those stories were horrific. Like, a lot of this is constantly preying on people, and you clearly represent a lot of principles that we take for granted in our current science, we're like, oh, I can't believe they did that, were seen as commonplace and acceptable a couple centuries ago, which really isn't that long.
No.
Like, even as like we were looking at it, like you're talking about the 1950s and 60s where these principles are really articulated about what is okay to do in transplant surgery. And so I love that you said to just meditate on that and allow that to sink more into our ethical consciousness, because man, we cannot lose this, right? Like, it's only just taken root, and we cannot lose this idea that like we can't just do this to other people. And it's very clear that like people did. And so again, thank you for your work. Really enjoyed reading it, and it's been a pleasure having you on.
Thanks so much, PJ. It's been a pleasure being on.